Ladies and gentlemen, we're privileged to have a very, well, dare I say it, special guest to introduce our 9th annual Bob Rose Lecturer. A man with humble beginnings. He worked as a telecom clerk for 5 years after an inglorious finish to Year 12. But once discovered, he rose and rose, Elsie. Initially with Network 10, where he worked with the president of the Collingwood Football Club, Eddie Maguire, he moved to Channel 7 in the late 80s, and he has done it all. Hosting and calling such sporting events from the Melbourne Cup, World Athletics Championships, motor racing, the Australian Open Tennis, the Australian Masters Golf, and all the Summer Olympic Games from Los Angeles in 1984 to Beijing in 2008. And of course, we all know him fondly as the mainstay of Channel 7's football coverage. To introduce our lecturer for the 9th annual Bob Rose Lecture, would you please welcome Bruce McAvaney.
Eddie did used to make me the cup of teas at Channel 10. They were delightful. Elsie, it's been great to meet you for the first time today. A real pleasure. And to you too, Peter. Can I talk about Collingwood for one moment before I introduce Andrew? Just for 1 minute. I feel a little compelled because they're sort of on the edge of a few things. I guess it means nothing if they don't win their first back-to-back premiership since 1936. All these, but if they beat Brisbane on Saturday night, it'll be their 13th consecutive win this year. Now, in a single season, they've only won more than 12 matches in 1903 and 1929. They're both golden periods of the club. It'll also be their 19th win for the season if they're successful. That would equal their greatest effort in a home-away season, 1973, but that didn't finish with a happy ending. A lot's been talked about blowouts and big margins, or Mickey Malthouse. No team has had a percentage like Collingwood since 1902, not even at this stage of the season, because they didn't play that many games in those days, so we've got to go back to them. But Mickey has the record for a team, 162.2%. That was West Coast in 1991 when they won their first 12. So Collingwood at the moment, I think, is sitting on about 182.5, so Mickey will best himself, I think. And one last thing about the crowds. The AFL can boast a record, 6 matches this year where the attendance has been 80,000 or plus. Collingwood have played in 5 of the 6. They've actually played in 11 of the last 12 home and away matches that have had 80,000 or more. And since that fateful Queen's Birthday match in 1958, where was it 99,000 that turned up? Collingwood have been in 44 of the 59, 80,000 plus. So I'm not sure if any club off the field or any team on the field collectively has been in a position like Collingwood is at this very moment. Eddie, congratulations. It's a great job. Now to the reason I'm here. They were impressive, by the way, Andrew, very impressive. You do forget, don't you? What a body. Lewis, I'm thinking Dancing with the Stars, aren't you? Anyway, our guest is not the first Andy Demetriou to play VFL/AFL footy. That honour went to another Andy who played 1 game for South Melbourne in 1977. Now, the stat sheets tell us that day that he didn't get a disposal. That might explain his short career. But he was playing against Collingwood at Victoria Park. True story. Our Andrew Demetriou had a much more successful debut. That was for North Melbourne against Footscray in round 7, 1981, out at Waverley Park. And it seems that the man who now reads the votes was immersed in the Brownlow right from the start. His captain coach that day was Malcolm Blight. His teammates included Keith Gregg, Gary Dempsey, Brian Wilson, Ross Glendinning, 5 men who won 6 Brownlows between them and also included David Dench and Shimmer. Andrew was in good company right from the start. He ended up playing 103 games for the Kangaroos. Now, coincidentally, that's the exact number their current star, Andrew Swallow, is sitting on, 103. I dare say Swallows had more clearances, but I reckon Andrew's had more hard ball gets this year. So after 7 seasons at the Kangas, I guess in an early sign of free agency, off he went to the Hawks, where in his last game he played against St Kilda in a thriller at the MCG, alongside Ayres, Brereton, Buckenara, Dipper, Langford and Mew. It was a big last quarter for the Hawks. They won, so Andrew started as a winner, went out as a winner. He actually had 17 disposals in that last game and kicked a goal. I'm not sure why he didn't play again. He might tell us today. We know that he allegedly hit 3 blokes when he was playing. One a year, actually, in 83, 84 and 85. Peter Bradbury, John Annear, and we saw it, David Rhys-Jones. He actually got off that one. He got off Rhys, got 2 matches for John Annear. So that meant he missed playing against, because he got the 2 matches against John Annear, he missed playing against Footscray on April the 14th. Andrew knows the significance of April the 14th each year. Do you know if you played that day, that was Mickey Malthouse's 3rd game as a senior coach for Footscray, so it's a while ago, Andrew. I'm not sure over the years how many players would like to have hit Andrew. Maybe a few this year, actually. Wouldn't mind giving him a biff. Believe it or not, Des English got off, but Wayne Blackwell from the Blues is the only one who can officially claim to have donged the now CEO of the AFL, because he got a couple of matches for doing it in 1986. So a very solid and at times successful footy career has made way to a stellar career and contribution off the field. So prior to being appointed to the chief executive position in September of 2003 at the AFL, Andrew was general manager of football operations, and before that served 2 years as chief executive officer of the AFL Players Association. I reckon he wouldn't mind wearing 2 hats for the next month or 2. His achievements are many and very impressive. 780,000 participants, 120,000 volunteers, more than 11,000 people employed. The code continues to grow and meet the challenges that confront it. The AFL competition is already in new territory this year with the Suns on the Gold Coast, about to expand further with GWS in suburban Sydney. He's recently negotiated the $1.253 billion rights deal, the richest sporting agreement in Australian sporting history. With 2 new teams come the development of 2 new stadiums, Metricom on the Gold Coast and the Showgrounds in Sydney. He's overseen the introduction of the illicit drug policy, the respect and responsibility policy, the extension of the Indigenous and multicultural programs. And amazing from my point of view, living in South Australia, he's been able to bring together cricket and football. After a 40-year war, we will see AFL at Adelaide Oval. I must say, when he arrives in Adelaide, it is presidential. Maybe more Henry Kissinger, sorting out the boys from Beirut and Cairo. Outside of footy, he's involved in a number of activities, including holding the title of Public Appeal Chairman of the Olivia Newton-John Cancer Centre. A great family man, married to Simone, father of 4. Not sure if the kids are Lionel Richie fans, but he did do a good job for you in that second grand final last year. I know if there were a reality TV challenge amongst the CEOs in Australian sport, Demetriou would be unbackable. He'd be $1. Andrew is without peer when quizzed on anything from the Kardashians to America's Top Model or Dancing with the Stars. Not only can he tell you which rehab centre Lindsay Lohan is currently in, he can nominate which bloke Kim Kardashian is engaged to at any moment in time. My daughter told me this morning that she's about to get hitched. Is that right? There you go. But finally, I think we have found a weak spot I'm told if you want half a chance of success at the negotiating table, stick one of his daughters on the other side. And if you want to be guaranteed a successful outcome, hire all three. So, Lewis, I don't think you'll need Lee and me in 5 years' time. Get the Demetriou girls when you're sitting alongside of him, and all will be sweet. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Demetriou.
Thank you for that very warm welcome. It's nice to get a different sort of introduction, particularly after when I arrived here, a colleague of mine who I know very well said to me he got into a lift with 3 or 4 people who said, gosh, I've been to these things. We've had Beverly O'Connor, Tim Lane, David Williamson were gone down market this year. So I feel really intimidated. As always, Bruce, your research has been meticulous, particularly about my daughters. Can't persuade them to sleep, let alone do anything else. I was particularly interested to hear about Andy Demetriou. Andy is actually a family friend of ours. He runs the Albert Park Deli, which many people in this room probably frequent. What isn't known is that he did play one game against Collingwood, but he was on the bench and never actually got a run. And the following week he was dropped. And he will never, ever, no one will ever pass that record of the shortest career that's ever played, I can assure you. But that probably explains all those letters I've been getting at the AFL for the past few years. I wondered who this Demetriou bloke was who's been stuffing up the game, but he's a good man. Look, it's a great honour to be invited to deliver the Bob Rose lecture, and I genuinely mean that. I'm also conscious that I follow some great names to have stood here, including Lee Matthews, who gave last year's lecture. Lee, of course, is a legend of Australian football and is widely recognised as the greatest player of the 20th century. Now, certainly you've never forgotten the first semi-final between Hawthorn and North Melbourne at the MCG in 1982. Now, it wasn't on the video that you just saw, and there's a good reason for that. When I became CEO of the AFL, I ordered all vision to be destroyed from our archives. But if you haven't seen it, I'm told you can still find it on YouTube. It was also Dermot Brereton's first game, for those that can remember. If you watch it, you'll see a passage of play where Dermot hand passes the ball out to Rodney Eade. I actually give chase to Rocket as he headed towards goal, only to look up and see, out of the corner of my eye, Lee Matthews coming towards me from the opposite direction, and remember shouting out something like, "Oh shit." Now, if you're barrack for Hawthorn, you probably would describe Lee's action as a shepherd. A very good shepherd, in fact. Now, if you're barrack for North Melbourne, you might describe it as something different. A shirt front, perhaps. Whatever it was, it felt like a Mack truck to me. I was still lying on the turf as Rocket ran in to an open goal. And it won't surprise people in this room to hear Hawthorn won the game, and Dermot actually kicked 5 goals on debut, and it kicked off an amazing career. But it was also the first and the only time that my late mother ever watched me play league football. She never went back again after seeing that. So I've also been very wary of Lee ever since. You might even say a little scared. To this day, if Lee ever calls wanting to do an interview, in fact, if Lee wants anything at all, I always say yes. But I do feel truly humbled to have been invited today. My association with the Rose family began with Bob's son Peter, who was my first wife, my late wife, Jan Bassett's publisher at Oxford University Press. Peter and Jan were great friends, and Peter gave the eulogy at Jan's funeral in 1999, the same year that Robert Rose also passed away. Peter later asked me to join the Robert Rose Foundation in honour of his brother, whose story has been well documented. Perhaps what's not well known is the outstanding and tireless work Peter has undertaken since Bob's passing to continue to help people with spinal injuries. Bob Rose is, of course, a name synonymous with Australian football, but also Bob was much more than a champion player and a coach. He was also a wonderfully devoted father, and the image of Bob pushing Robert in his wheelchair to Collingwood games is something etched in the minds of any of those who have witnessed it. Bob's love ran just as deep for his beloved wife Elsie and second son Peter, who has forged a very successful career in the literary world. A career I know Bob was very proud of, and I'm sure he will be just as proud that Peter is carrying on his great legacy to help people like Robert live better lives. While it's more than 8 years since Bob passed away, his life remains an inspiration to us all. To those of us who are immersed in the game like football, it's a powerful reminder of what's really important: the strength of family and the importance of strong values and their influence on our decision-making right throughout our lives. My first wife was very, very dear to me and was a wonderful friend, but most importantly, had wonderful values. Her sense of social justice, respect for others, and most importantly, care for others, I admired enormously. Today I'd like to reflect a little on my own upbringing and how it helped me connect with the game of Australian football and shape my values as a person, but also in business and my role as Chief Executive of the AFL. My parents both arrived in Australia from Cyprus in 1951, albeit separately. How they came to be here are quite remarkable stories in themselves. Both are in their early 20s. My father was lying in his bed in his village in Cyprus one night when he was suddenly woken up and told to pack his things and escort his uncle out of the country. His uncle had got a girl pregnant and the family were coming around to kill him. Within hours, they were both on a boat to Australia. And it just so happened that 6 weeks later that my mother was also on her way to Australia. Her mother had ordered her to leave Cyprus after she'd fallen in love with a local boy who had contracted tuberculosis, which in those days was seen as a death sentence. They both arrived here unable to speak a word of English and without a cent to their name. It wasn't until some time later that they were introduced and an arranged marriage occurred and that they discovered that they were from nearby villages. And after being married for a couple of years, they had 4 boys, of which I'm the youngest, and we lived in a 2-bedroom house at the back of my parents' fish and chip shop in Coburg. One of my strongest childhood memories is my parents getting up at 6 o'clock each morning to work in the shop and coming back late at night exhausted and smelling of fish and chips. While my parents toiled, my brothers and I amused ourselves with games of footy in winter and cricket in summer in the back laneway. We'd also play matches with other kids from the neighbourhood in the car park at the local Woolworths. Now, these matches were great for 2 reasons. First, they taught me the value of staying on my feet because we used to play on concrete in the Woolworths car park. If you ever fell over, you'd cut your legs open. But they also helped break down barriers. The kids we played with were from a diverse range of backgrounds: Italian, Greek, Maltese, Australian, and sport was the common language. For us children of migrants, sport was a great way of connecting to the community, making friends and seeking new opportunities. And I still remember the day my brothers and I all played together at Pascoe Vale. As the youngest, I found myself getting belted by a player from the opposition team. And the next thing I knew, my father had run onto the ground and jumped in between us. I was surprised. Here I was fighting with a fellow and there's my father standing in between us. I thought, where's Paul Roos? As surprised as I was, it was nothing on the bloke who was belting me, I can tell you. It was all rather embarrassing and my father was rubbed out for a few weeks by the Essendon District Football League. I think it's fair to say my parents weren't great spectators when it came to sport. But they did instil in us many of the values which I still hold dear to this day. They include hard work, integrity, sacrifice, and respect for others. And I shall never forget, ever, the phone call that my mother received to tell her that her mother had died, and she went into a little corner and wept alone. And a few years later, the phone call that my father received to say that his mother had died. And he too went into a corner and wept alone. They never saw their parents again from the time they left. They're values that my wife Simone and I have tried to instill into our own children, because you want your children to want and to learn that not everything comes easy, to never take anything we have for granted, and also, most importantly, respect other people from all walks of life. My parents also believed firmly in education. My brothers and I all went to Newlands High School. Newlands High School was around until Jeff Kennett closed it. That's why I've always got a bit of a thing about Jeff. On the other side of the school was Pentridge. For some kids it was a toss-up, whether you ended up there or at university. Fortunately, I went to university. But my parents never returned to Cyprus until 1984, the year after I finished university, the year after the final son had completed his education. This was true sacrifice. And it was the early 1980s that I was trying to combine study with a football career. It wasn't always easy getting the balance right, particularly when your attention gets diverted by other pursuits, like the opposite sex, having a beer with your mates, and punting on horses. In fact, I probably spent as much time with my head in a form guide as I did in my books. The form guide may not have provided me with too many winners, but thankfully the books did. It led to a career in teaching before I became involved in various business ventures, and the first was a company called Retinium, which manufactures false teeth. In fact, I'm still a director today. Now, you can imagine the sort of conversation it made for at dinner parties when I used to catch up with my friends from university. After telling me which law firms they were working for, they'd turn around and ask me what was I doing these days, and I'd say, well, I'm actually selling false teeth. It was a real showstopper, I can tell you. But those experiences were invaluable. They took me right round the world, doing business in countries like Italy, where I met a great mentor, a great business partner in a gentleman called Giovanni Piazza. And I still remember in 1988 flying to Bologna to meet Giovanni, who was our supplier. I was collected at the airport by a driver who fancied himself as Juan Fangio and drove us 90 kilometres to a nearby town, Rovigo, in about 8 minutes. As soon as I met Giovanni, I liked him. He was not only very personable, but he taught me a lot about business and the art of negotiation. He did all his business in person. He did all his business person to person. His word was also his bond, and he believed that any negotiation where one party leaves the table unhappy or feeling as if they've been dudded is a negotiation not worth having. We travelled to various countries around the world, and I observed firsthand his craft at work. And this has served me well in my role at the AFL, where you have to negotiate with a range of stakeholders, be it clubs, players, broadcasters, or government at any one time. And you have to do it, above all, in good faith. It was also an important lesson in collaboration and realising that if everyone is involved in benefiting, then everyone will continue to work hard to ensure the relationship prospers, that you grow together. Travelling also opened my eyes to other cultures, but also reinforced the lessons from my parents about respecting people regardless of their backgrounds. And it's something that we've done with our children, because I think it not only gives them a great insight into the world, but also helps them build strong values. In 1996, my late wife was diagnosed with breast cancer. And in 1998, as Jan's condition started to deteriorate, I was asked to join the AFL Players Association. This eventually led me back to football, first as the CEO of the AFL Players Association, and then to the AFL as Football Operations Manager, and of course now as CEO. And in a sense, I've come a full circle, back into the game, which was a big part of my early life, but also helped shape my values. And it was something I've been determined to do as CEO of the AFL, ensure that the organisation has a clear set of values and that we hire people who are prepared to live the values that are best summed up by three principles. First, to be accountable, to act with integrity and to deal with people honestly, ethically and transparently. Second, to be progressive, to respect the great history of our game and its role in the community, but also to embrace new ideas and change. We say if it ain't broke, fix it anyway. And third, to be respectful, to embrace diversity and inclusion, and to listen to other viewpoints and to act with humility and modesty. These three pillars support what is most important to us at the AFL, and that is our legacy, leaving the game and the community in better shape for future generations. How many people in this room ask themselves the question, what do I want to be remembered for? What's my legacy? The legacy dominated my conversation with the then chairman of the AFL, the late Ron Evans, in 2003, when Ron told me I'd been appointed CEO. A great mentor and a great friend, Ron had a very clear message. And he told me, you don't own the game. As an administrator, you get to borrow the game, but you need a clear plan and a vision for how you want to hand it on to the next generation in better shape. That wasn't a conversation about finances. It was a conversation about values and using those values to guide the organisation in its role as a community leader. I happen to think that a leader sets the culture in an organisation. There wouldn't be many people out there who don't know what I stand for and what the AFL stands for. And I've said to my staff and my management team, of which I'm very proud, I've said the same things that I've adopted in all of my business life, and that is this. First and foremost, I'm here to develop you as people. That when you leave this organisation, you will be a better person. Secondly, in return, all I ask for from you is your loyalty and your commitment. And if you do that, together we will achieve amazing things. And the things that we've tackled and confronted, like illicit drugs and respect for women, are also issues important to the community. And as far as I'm concerned, they are part of the same value chain. And we don't always get it right. When you have 800 AFL players and 750,000 total participants, mistakes will be made. But we will continue to deal with those issues according to the values we hold dear. Now, people might ask what all of this has to do with football. The answer is everything. You can't claim to be a leader or leading organisation in this community if you don't care about and embrace the notion of trying to build a better community. And all of us need to do that. Sports, business, government, individuals. And I also believe that it's important to make decisions. People don't want leaders who procrastinate or simply engage in spin, just as they don't want leaders who make decisions based on short-term self-interest. They want people who not only work hard but believe in what they do, take hard decisions and back themselves to achieve results. And as Chief Executive Officer of the AFL, I've also been the beneficiary of a big decision taken more than 25 years ago to establish the game's first independent commission. I mentioned Ron Evans before, but we've also been blessed to have great people on the AFL Commission, like Ron's successor, Mike Fitzpatrick, Colin Carter, Graham Samuel, Peter Scanlon, and the list would go on. And I could go on and talk about people who have served the game in my role, the greats, Jack Hamilton, Ross Oakley, Wayne Jackson, and probably the greatest visionary of all, Alan Aylett. Who can imagine Alan Aylett fought hard with the MCC just to play football on a Sunday when they said it would never happen? Friday night football said it would never happen. Things that we take for granted today. People who left their egos at the door and made decisions in the best interests of the game. This set in place the foundation for the future of our game but also ensured that all decisions are made with the long-term interests of the game in mind. And by that I mean the game at all levels. And it's a point that Mike Fitzpatrick has reinforced during his time as chairman, a time in which we have sought to grow the game in Queensland and New South Wales and beyond. And from this base, with an incredibly hard-working executive team and staff, an executive team which I'm proud to say has got the most wonderful set of values, we've been able to build a game that is better financed, more professional, which attracts the best players, the biggest crowds, and is now broadcast on more platforms that, in turn, helps deliver bigger returns that can be reinvested back into the game. But this is only part of the story. Yes, more than 7 million people attended AFL matches last year. Yes, there are more than 750,000 people participating in our game, and more than 650,000 people, or 1 in 36 Australians, are members of AFL clubs. And yes, Australian football now generates nearly $4 billion in economic activity and employs the equivalent of more than 11,000 people. Proof that football impacts on many lives beyond the boundary. They're all impressive numbers, but at the end of the day, they're just numbers. That's not what's really important about the game. And as Eddie Maguire said at the AFL season's launch this year, we're all involved in this game because at some stage we fell in love with a team, a player, or the game itself. And the game became a part of our life. And as the son of migrants, I know exactly what Eddie means. Footy gave my brothers and I a sense of community, gave us a sense of belonging. Someone once asked me how I would describe our game. And I like to think of Australian football as a great democratiser, a game for anyone and everyone, a game that is inclusive, accessible and affordable, and a game that doesn't discriminate. Footy's a great meeting place. Every week it brings diverse groups of people together from across the community, people from a range of backgrounds, but with a common passion for the game. And people don't come to our game because they want to impose their values on it. They come to our game because of its values. It gives us all a sense of belonging to something, a sense of ritual. It's the same sense of belonging which draws people to football clubs or their local Auskick centre on a Saturday morning. A few weeks ago, I had the great pleasure of launching a book on Liam Jurrah. What other game in the world could produce a story like this? His journey from the red dirt oval of Yuendumu to the MCG is worthy of Hollywood. Yet his story is ours. It's perhaps no coincidence that he plays for the Melbourne Football Club, which also produced an Irishman called Jim Stynes. Nobody gave Jimmy a chance of making it our game until he won a Brownlow medal. Now he's helping to rebuild the club, despite facing his own life and death battle. And it reinforced to me that you can be black, white, tall, skinny, Irish, Indigenous, rich, poor, young, old. But there is a place for you in Australian football. Take young Tyler Fishlock, a young boy who lost his sight in both eyes to cancer. He loves footy, and all his mates were playing Auskick at Caroline Springs. So the Auskick coordinator there, Michael Solomon, adapted a series of drills using ropes and bells to ensure that Tyler not only plays, but he feels as if he belongs. A similar thing is happening in Western Australia, where a local Auskick centre has adapted its own drills so young children with autism can play and enjoy the game. This sort of ingenuity, combined with the desire to bring people together, is why our game is blessed with more than 120,000 volunteers who give so much of their time, their energy and enthusiasm week in and week out. And football is also very forgiving. What other game can embrace the likes of Ben Cousins and Andrew Cracker? It could have been very easy for football to push them away, but instead it reached out and help them on their path to rehabilitation. The way we help people in need is surely the ultimate measure of any decent and humanitarian society. Why should it be any different with football? Yes, it would be great to be able to one day say that I had a hand in a $1.25 billion broadcast deal that helped secure the future of the game. And yes, it would be great to be able to say one day that I had a role in expanding our competition into Queensland and Western Sydney to help grow the game for generations to come. Or that I played my part, as Bruce said, in rebuilding Adelaide Oval to help secure the future of the game in South Australia. But it will give me just as much pride to say that I made a difference to not just the game, but also the community. That is where, when the AFL embraced the community, after the terrible bushfires and floods, that I was there when the MCG was transformed into a sea of pink to raise money and awareness for breast cancer. That I was there when the Palestinian and Israeli peace team came together to play in the International Cup. And hopefully one day I'll be able to hold my hand on my heart and say, I did my best to leave the game and the community in better shape. But importantly, I also left the game the same person who entered it and who has been privileged to be part of it, and who has been privileged to have the game I love be such a big part of me. These are the values that Bob Rose personified. These are the values we should all hold dear to us, and these are the values we should all aspire to. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Demetriou. Thank you, Andrew, for that wonderfully insightful address. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I might say just before I introduce Peter Rose that Andrew was, before he became Chief Executive Officer of the AFL, was actually offered the role as Chief Executive Officer at the Collingwood Football Club. Not many people know that. I suppose it's the same thing anyway, Eddie. To respond and give thanks, would you please welcome acclaimed author and Bob's son, Peter Rose.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As you can imagine, the Bob Rose annual lecture is a marvellous occasion for the Roses. We look forward to it each year. I well remember the first of them, Geoffrey Blaney's address in the old long room at the MCC just before the wreckers moved in. And for me and for Elsie and Kevin and Natalie and Christopher and whichever other Roses are able to attend, it's always a special occasion. My remarks will be brief, and I do so really representing the Robert Rose Foundation, which I've been honoured to chair, and I'd like to acknowledge various trustees in the room, Graham Chipp and David Poulton, Kevin Rose, of course, Andrew, Peter Turner of Independence Australia, I believe, is here. I would also particularly like to welcome to the Robert Rose Foundation a dear friend of the Rose family, our new ambassador, Tony Charlton, who's been mentioned already. He was recently elevated to the AFL Hall of Fame. And Tony, I'd like you to know that the foundation is right behind you at this time. You have made a remarkable contribution to media and society in this country, and you're a very dear friend of the Roses, so our very best wishes. Thank you. Andrew, that was a wonderful lecture. We've all enjoyed it and learned from it. I'm always slightly relieved when there is a sort of a non-strategic football lecture that I have to follow, because many of you will know that my football acumen, I'm a passionate pie, but my football acumen is very limited. Yes, never got above the seas. Bruce has already attested to your remarkable leadership of the league. It's a force, a unique force, and probably a unique force in world sport. It was wonderful to hear about your parents. They're fantastically impressive story, and it's a story, isn't it, that was typified that remarkable generation, and attests, I think, to Australia's preparedness to welcome people, especially people in need, and let us hope that that is a tradition that Australia maintains in coming decades. Andrew has been a long and inaugural trustee of the foundation, and to fit that role in, and to find time to write a lecture in a very busy life is much appreciated. It was also terrific. It brought back wonderful memories of Jan Bassett, whom I had the honour to publish on many occasions, and had been a friend before that. And Jan is someone Christopher and I and many of our friends, we revere her memory and love the books. Elsie's always reading the Facing Island, Jan's remarkable memoir. So they were very nice memories, and wonderful to hear of your new family and those beautiful children. You're very fortunate. I always, apologies to those of you who have heard me talk briefly at these functions, I often draw your attention to the Robert Rose Foundation, and as you know, there is a form on your table to help us. The need is acute, and the money that we raise at functions like this goes to quadriplegics and paraplegics in acute need, so please consider helping us. But I do want to just briefly allude to, Andrew has spoken impressively about AFL's commitment to social justice and respect. There is before society, before all of us now, a remarkable new social reform. You will have read last week of the government's warm response, maybe perhaps not as ironclad a response as some had hoped for, but a warm response to the Productivity Commission's long-awaited recommendations about the urgent need in the society for a national disability insurance scheme. For many people, this represents as big a reform and as overdue a reform as universal superannuation or equal pay. It is of that order. At present, many people with grievous disabilities, like my brothers, paralysed from the neck down, do not have, apart from a very small pension, have no hospital coverage, medical cost coverage, because of the nature of their accident. If you have a particular kind of car accident in this country, or if you are injured at your workplace, you might be covered. I don't know what the proportion is, but I think it's more than half of people have no coverage at all. My brother had one bit of luck in February 1974. His accident followed the TAC legislation, that remarkable Hamer government initiative, by 2 days. Robert's medical costs, and they were considerable over the next 25 years, were covered by society. But for that, my father often said, he and my mother would have been bankrupted. They would have been happily bankrupted, but they would have been bankrupted. Many people in this country are bankrupted, and many people get squalid medical assistant or inadequate medical assistant and rehabilitation and re-entry into society. So we cannot stress enough the importance of the campaign to urge on the Gillard government. It's got some powerful players right behind this, Bill Shorten in particular. The AFL community, I know, is very alert to this campaign. The AFL community has direct experience of grievous disability. At least Kevin and I and Elsie were at the Footscray in '75 when Neil Saxey was rendered a quadriplegic in front of us. He had no his medical costs were not picked up by society. It seems to us that it is truly anomalous for a wealthy, humane Western society to cast out so many grievously disabled people and to leave them to their own resources or their families' shrinking resources So anything we, as a privileged group, let's be honest, can do to urge on government and through the media or whatever measure will be vitally important over the next year, because really this is a scheme that is just made to be enacted, legislated next year, and let's not leave it to about 2017. But that... But that's enough from me. My task now is to become a kind of barrel person and hand out and thank our two speakers today, and we'll start with Bruce McAvaney. There is a copy for Bruce of this a very impressive new volume, just launched this week, and thanks to Jeff Slattery for making it available. Glenn McFarlane, I don't think Glenn is with us today, history of the remarkable Jock McHale, and Bruce some other goodies, and with thanks for that fantastic introduction. My pleasure, my pleasure. Thank you very much. And to our very special lecturer, Andrew Demetriou. Thank you. Just forgetting our inimitable compere, to thank Michael Christian, a gift as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to again remind you of the envelopes on your tables, and if you would, donate generously to the Robert Rose Foundation. Just a couple of thank yous before we close for the day. The videos you saw with Bob and Robert, and also the startling performance by Andrew in the game against Carlton. Thanks to Lewis Martin from Channel 7. There, Lewis, thank you, and also Gordon Bennett. Thank you very much for putting the videos together. I'd also like to thank the RACV, and we have a couple of directors with us today, Ross Heron and Graham Chipp, for your wonderful support. I'd also like to thank the committee of the CBD group, in particular David Poulton. Stand up please, David. Got your back, thank you. Who does an absolute power of work to get this event up and running. And finally, on behalf of the CBD group, can I thank Andrew and Bruce for your wonderful contributions today. Great to see you all, and hopefully see you back next year. Thank you.